Hey folks, Dr. Mike here for Renaissance Periodization, RPU, RP+, the whole thing. First video, first installment of the Advanced Hypertrophy Concepts and Tools lecture series. The first installment is Directed Adaptation. Let's take a look at the contents, and then we will talk about, right after that, what the purpose of this series is, and I'll do that with every single one of these videos. So if you get to a video late, you can figure out what the purpose is after a couple slides, and then maybe go back and watch the earlier ones. So directed adaptation is the concept here. Contents, first thing we're going to talk about what is the purpose of the lecture series. Then we're going to talk about what directed adaptation actually is. We're going to go through 4 reasons why directed adaptation exists, and what that means as far as programming is going to be concerning, give a couple of examples, and then do summary and implications. So what we're doing with these videos is we're going through the hypertrophy book and deriving really important concepts that I think really deserve a chat of their own, not just within the context of the book, but by themselves, right? When we're writing about these concepts in the context of the hypertrophy book, we're not so much breezing over some of them, but we're leaving them in the context of the flow of the hypertrophy book. We talk about a certain concept, we talk about how it works, we talk about how it feeds into the next concept, and into the next discussion, and the next, and the next, and that's how a book works. It's really strange to read a book that, you go, oh, this makes sense, that makes sense, aha, now this, and then at some point it goes like, whoop, off on a big tangent, and like, that's nice, isn't that cool? And then comes back and goes, hey, by the way, here's this new concept, right? So what we're doing here in these videos is, since we can't take those tangents in the book because it would ruin the book as far as reading ability is concerned, or for sure reading pleasure and comprehension, here we're taking these tangents. The best way to go about these videos is to have a good understanding of training theory, so you probably should have worked through all the RPU courses so far, all the basic courses for sure, or have gotten an education somewhere in that regard. We're going to be doing very little reference to the specific physiology because you should already know it. Like when I say motor unit in this lecture series, if you don't know what a motor unit is, you'll probably understand very little of what I'm saying otherwise. What we're doing here is we're sort of indulging in those tangents, and they're not so much tangents as they are very, very, very useful things to talk about. That if we deeply understand them after you have already a good base understanding, once you read the hypertrophy book, you're going to be like, wow, this makes a ton of sense, and you'll recognize familiar concepts. The other really good way to do this is to wait to watch these videos, and you can watch them twice probably, watch them as they come out, and then potentially wait to watch them or watch them again once you've read the hypertrophy book. Once you've read the entire hypertrophy book, Scientific Principles of Hypertrophy Training, that is, then you're going to watch these lectures, and some of the concepts that were not so much brushed over, but mentioned and explained, but you maybe wanted to know more detail about them, really what they imply, what their constraints are, how they would work in another potential way, then they were exemplified in the book, then this is the lecture series for you. So it's called Advanced for a reason. It's going to be really, really high-level stuff, and a lot of real nitty-gritty to make sure that we have a really fully developed theory of hypertrophy training at the end of all of this. So let's get in and talk about directed adaptation. Lecture number 1, and there's going to be many, many more of these. So what is direct adaptation? As you probably already know, it is a sub-principle of the specificity principle of training, which there are 2. And it basically says in a really simple way that if you want to improve a certain system the most that it can be improved, you probably want to train that system in a similar way for an extended period of time. That too much different kind of training might not cause the best directed adaptation directed towards a specific purpose, right? If the systemic improvement is very specified, then a very specific kind of training is probably required over and over to really drive the message of adaptation as much home as possible and get the best possible results. In a hypertrophy application, if you want to grow muscle in a certain area, you'll probably need to train that area, for example, the biceps, in a very similar way, potentially with very similar or same exercises, probably for weeks on end, in order to get the most long-term muscle growth to result. And we'll talk about what long-term muscle growth really means a little bit later in this discussion, because short-term and long-term muscle growth might actually be some pretty different processes, right? Of course, saying that training should be unidirectional to some extent automatically implies that training that has too much variation, for example, changing exercises every other session, every other week, is probably not a good idea. Probably not the best idea, right? It could probably still work for a lot of people, but it might be optimal to stick to something for a little bit longer, certain set scheme, certain rep scheme, certain progression, in a certain type of exercise selection, right? Why is direct adaptation a concept? It's not just something that is sort of revealed wisdom, like, oh yeah, direct adaptation, like that's definitely a thing. It's a thing for 4 distinct reasons. And we're going to go through each one of those reasons of why direct adaptation actually results, why it is observed that is the most effective way of training. So reason number 1 is termed damage reduction via novelty. So here's the deal. When you begin a new method of training, for example, you choose a different exercise, which is a really big one, or you radically change rep ranges. Let's say you're doing sets of 5 to 10 reps, and then next week you do sets of 25 to 30 reps or something like that. Cadences, you change from doing all explosive reps to all eccentric, slow reps. Volumes, you take your volume from 3 sets in a workout and you do 6 sets in a workout the next workout. Loading, which is sort of inverse to rep ranges, like you're used to lifting really light and you go super heavy. That brings a novelty of the stimulus. It's not a stimulus your physiology is used to, and novelty has some predictable effects with it. One of them is that your muscular connective tissue is just unused to the novel stimulus, and a lot of the way that connective tissue and muscular tissue get used to a certain stimulus is they develop a sort of a lattice work of connective tissue and reinforcement to reduce the amount of damage that muscle takes during any kind of exertion. If you're not used to a certain type of exertion, forces coming from different angles through different exercises, for example, then your motor units that are involved, parts of the muscle that are involved, even parts of the connective tissue that are involved, are exposed to forces through lines and vectors that they're just not used to at all. And that can cause a disproportionately great amount of damage, right? Now, the good news is that only happens really on the first or second training session. And after a few training sessions, these adaptations tend to be very rapid, and the damage amount per unit of volume goes down significantly. So it's a good thing. Why is it a good thing? If damage is really high, then it's been shown pretty clearly, and theoretically makes a lot of sense, that muscle growth actually declines. So why would this be? Well, it turns out that any individual muscle or motor unit or even muscle cell, definitely your body as a whole, has a certain amount of energy and resources to commit to what we call recovery adaptations, recovery/adaptation, right? It's such a universal resource pool that sometimes in sports science, we just use the term RA, recovery adaptation, to mean almost the same thing because it comes from the same pool of resources. But here's the thing. If you have a ton of resources for adaptation and you somehow stimulate adaptation to occur, then, you have all this resource for adaptation drive to occur, and then adaptation occurs to a huge extent. You get better and everything as well. However, we know that training hard doesn't just stimulate adaptation. It also taxes your recovery. So if you train a little bit hard, then you can stimulate a lot of adaptation, but it costs you some degree of recovery. If you train super duper hard, it costs you more recovery. If you train really, really crazy hard, it costs you a ton of recovery. And then as the recovery demand really goes up, as the damage levels really go up, then the amount of recovery it takes to heal that damage can be so high that it literally just impinges on the amount of adaptation resource we have left over, right? It's almost like, if you have $10 and you want to go get a sandwich across town and you buy an Uber or something like that, there's like a certain distance of Uber ride at which you just spent all your money on the Uber and there's absolutely nothing left for the sandwich. Just the same way, if you damage the muscles excessively through a really novel stimulus with a very high volume and so on and so forth, then you're going to present a really awesome stimulus to adapt, right? Theoretically, right? Just like if you step into an Uber and go to your favorite restaurant 10 miles away, yeah, you're there, you're ready to eat, but you don't have any money left over. Just the same way as if you present a huge stimulus, it eats up all of your recovery adaptive resources, you recover, hopefully, but you get almost no adaptation. So this has been demonstrated to occur in several direct research experiments, which is really, really awesome, right? So when we look at novelty's effect, specifically changing really big stimuli like rep ranges to a great extent, huge jumps in volume, different exercises, we start to realize that if we always introduce a ton of novelty, we always expose our bodies to a ton of damaging stimuli, and then we're always taking that potential adaptive resource and really shutting it down, really eating it up to do basically just recovery, right? It's like if you really thought damage was the end-all be-all of hypertrophy, you would just get into a car accident once a week, and holy crap, that you would get jacked. Right? Camera guy is laughing at that. So, I mean, you say, right? Holy crap, you'd have huge bones and everything. But it turns out it doesn't work like that. Like, if you stimulate yourself to a large extent, you get a huge stimulus to use the adaptive resources, and you have a lot of adaptive resources left to use, so you get your best gains, right? Obviously, if you train barely at all, yeah, you have a ton of a recovery adaptive resource to use, but like, it's not being used. Right? It doesn't make any sense, because like it's like taking an Uber to 1 mile into the 10-mile journey to your favorite restaurant. Yeah, you have $9 left or whatever, but like there's no restaurant around, so there's no point for that, right? So it's kind of a meet halfway sort of scenario where you want a robust amount of stimulus to cause, some disruption so that you get the good stimulus and have plenty left over from recovery adaptation to actually fuel adaptation. So if you're always doing novelty, you have usually such high levels of damage that you're just needlessly cutting your stimulus short, right? An interesting analogy here, it goes like this. If you have a city that's been exposed sort of regularly to tornadoes, for example, after a while, in the modern times, usually weeks and months, and back in the olden times, years and decades, the city will make structural adaptations to withstand tornadoes. Like, if a city regularly gets tornadoes, they're probably not going to have a lot of houses made out of straw. A lot of the houses are going to have basements, things like there's going to be a lot of reinforced steel and concrete, the stuff tornadoes really can't knock down, and so on and so forth. Like, it makes sense because they get presented with the same thing all the time. On the other hand, imagine that you hit, 1 year you have a crazy tornado season. The next year, out of nowhere, you have like 3 earthquakes. The adaptations for tornadoes and earthquakes are very, very different. And then you have a hurricane season the next year. And oh my God, what adaptations is your city supposed to make? Who knows, right? It's getting pulled in every single direction. It's getting tons of damage every time. But after that 3-year process, how much do we expect? How good are the adaptations to all 3 of those things? Probably not great. And they're probably just a ton of chaos and a ton of missed opportunity to make improvements, because the city has to shell out so much money for all this damage. Where are they going to get money from if they just barely recovered from tornadoes? They started adapting to tornadoes and then boom, earthquake. So not only did they sink a bunch of money in tornado adaptation that was gone, right? The earthquake ruined a bunch of other stuff. Now they're even deeper into the hole. They start to make some sort of earthquake and maybe tornado adaptations towards the second year. And then boom, hurricanes, and all those basements get flooded. Right? There's a reason a lot of hurricane prone areas don't even have basements. But if you're in a tornado prone area, you need a basement, right? It's sort of one or the other, right? So after a while, this basically results in a whole lot of damage to the city, a whole lot of cost, and not much in the form of reasonable adaptation. At some point, the city might just be like, we're moving from here, and everyone packs up and leaves and goes somewhere the hell else where it's not pure hell as far as natural disasters. You don't want to make that similar analogous situation for your body. Shocking and new stuff is cool when you're really, really stale in your training, because it can reinvigorate your training, but you have to start out with very little of it, and it's something you have to use sort of very strategically, right? If you do it all the time, one big fact is that it's going to cause a lot of damage through novelty, and then you're not going to cause a lot of muscle growth, all right? Reason number 2, technique and mind-muscle improvement with the stimulus to fatigue ratio. So when you first start an exercise or even a rep scheme or a cadence, you're probably not adapted to it fully and you're not that good at it. For example, if you start bench pressing, your bar can be wobbly and you can't really find a good bar path yet because you're just starting out bench pressing, which means that you're not getting the best possible stimulus because you spend some of your energy pushing the pecs as hard as possible, but then they get off track. So you have to turn the pecs down or turn them off, reposition the bar using your delts and other small muscles, and then keep pushing. So every single rep's not super efficient as far as stimulus is concerned, but because you're always trying to adjust and go back and forth, and because you're consistently putting the bar into positions that are not the best for the joints, like the perfect groove is, you're actually causing more fatigue, also more psychological fatigue because you feel like an idiot because you can't do the exercise properly. Just confusion and frustration definitely contribute to fatigue, but just mechanically. Another one is squats. If you squat back too much, your lower back takes a hit. If you squat forward too much, your knees take a hit. And none of those is great for your quads, because if you're squatting too far forward, your quads feel like you're not stable. There's actually the central nervous system will decrease power to your quads, so your muscle activation will be suboptimal. Also, muscle activation is usually suboptimal when there's any degree of instability. The more stable an exercise, the better the muscle activation. So here's the thing. If you change exercises every single week, for example, you always suck. Like, you literally never get used to any exercise, which is cool because you get sore and stuff as far as that goes. And we know that if you get too sore, it goes in the negative, right? So not only is each individual workout probably too damaging if you do enough volume in it to get your best gains, what also happens is that, like, you're never super, super good at the exercises and you can't milk them out to the most that they can be milked out. How do you milk them out? Well, you sequence multiple training sessions in a row. You do mostly squats for your leg workout this Monday. Next Monday, you do mostly squats. The Monday after that, you do mostly squats. Every single week or every other couple sessions that you do squats, you get better at them. How do you get better at them? Your bar path stabilizes. So first of all, you wobble less, which means you can produce higher forces in the target muscles, which means you stimulate more muscle growth because tension's a huge muscle growth stimulus. Especially, you produce forces that are the highest with your high threshold motor units. Those are the fastest twitch motor units. Those are also the most growth prone, right? So you stabilize. Another one is you find a better groove that results in two things. One, it stimulates the target muscle more. Like, if you bench to here, you might sort of feel my pecs. You bench to here, sort of feel my pecs. After a couple sessions, you start benching in the middle and you're like, oh man, like, I really feel my pecs on this. A lot of tension throughput. That's good. That's more stimulus, right? So all of a sudden, you're doing better for your muscles with that better groove. But also, and a good example here is something like the squat or the deadlift, your groove is now safer. And not just safer in an acute sense, safer in a long-term sense, because it does less joint wear and tear, because you all of a sudden have a really, really good perception of, okay, if my knees are too far forward, my knees hurt. If my knees are too far back, or my hips are too far back, my hip and lower back hurts. But there's this middle there just right that really spreads the load evenly. I can sit down on my heels and everything feels really, really good. Not only can I produce a ton of force there into the target muscles, but also I'm not accumulating a ton of wear and tear and a ton of stress every single time. So basically, your stimulus level starts to escalate per unit of volume as you do an exercise longer and longer, and your fatigue starts to go down. So your stimulus to fatigue ratio, which is super important for training, which we'll have its own lecture on it at some point, or we'll beat that to death, but it's pretty intuitive to understand for you advanced folks. More stimulus, less fatigue, that's a good thing. So if you do an exercise for the first time, you're like, man, let's do some new exercise. I really felt my pecs and this was really good, but like, that technique was kind of awkward. The next time you do an exercise, the technique will almost certainly be less awkward. You'll find that you can do a much better job keeping the bar stable or keeping yourself stable. You'll find that you find a track that is less painful to connective tissues and joints and allows you to produce more force. Your strength will go up, which means that you'll be able to stimulate the working muscles even better. In a very related process, almost the same process, your ability to connect mind to muscle, which has been shown to enhance hypertrophy, feeling your pecs working during a press, feeling your biceps working during a curl, feeling your quads during leg presses, for example, versus your glutes, your adductors, or something else. Mind-muscle connection steadily improves as you do the same exercise over and over. As a matter of fact, the first couple of sessions of a compound movement like squats or bent rows, a lot of times mind-muscle connection is not even something you focus on. You focus just on technical proficiency. Like, I just want to stabilize my squat and make sure that I'm like working the target muscles in a safe way that it's not hurting my joints. But after a couple of sessions, the mind-muscle connection starts to pick up. Where you're like, okay, I have a really good technique. Now I just shift my weight just a little, activate my quads just a little, push my hips just a little, and wow, I really feel it in my quads. And then next week you feel it even more in your quads. And if someone's like, hey man, a couple weeks later, they're like, I don't feel squats in my quads. You're like, boy, oh boy, if I could just give you my brain, you would trash your quads with just a couple sets of squats because I'm so good at activating my quads doing that stuff. That is something that comes only with multiple exposures. You cannot maximize mind-muscle connection on a first time. You just can't. And if you find an exercise that for the first time you ever tried it, it's a really great mind-muscle connection. I promise you, the second, third, and fourth time you do it, it'll be an even better mind-muscle connection because that's a learned, practiced skill. Mind-muscle connection improves the stimulus, which is awesome. So all of a sudden, you have technical proficiency improving the stimulus, reducing fatigue, and mind-muscle connection improving the stimulus. It's in every one of your best interests for hypertrophy to continue to use the same exercise as long as the fatigue per unit is low and the stimulus is really high, and for at least weeks of a mesocycle. At least 4 weeks. At the very least. In almost every case, stimulus to fatigue ratio continues to escalate for a given movement per repetition, for example, right? And the mind-muscle connection also improves. So, it's a really, really, really powerful thing. The example I have here in my notes on the presentation is the hack squat foot position mind muscle example. The first time you use a hack squat machine, you'll put your feet sort of where you think they belong, but you're not going to turn them optimally, and then they may be too far forward, too far back, right, or too far apart, wide, or too narrow. And, you can only play with your stance so much during the 3 working sets that you have. And you'll sort of figure out, like, okay, by the second, by the third working set, you're like, okay, I definitely screwed up when I did this. I think it's this, but I'm not sure if it's this or that. The next workout you come in, it's this and not this, that. You play with this. And you're like, okay, I think it's this, but I need to confirm it. On the third workout, you confirm, like, okay, wow, this is actually pretty good. And then on the fourth workout, you work on this. And on the sixth workout, this is confirmed. We could say that your best gains on the hack squat as far as muscle stimulus are just now starting out in reference to how much fatigue you're producing on workout number 6. It took you 6 fucking workouts to figure out where to put your feet. It is not an arbitrary thing. I know that a lot of you who have trained for a while know that when you start a new machine, sometimes you're like, man, that sucked. Or like you do 3 or 4 sets with certain grip handles and maybe it has options. Then you try another grip and you're like, I should have been doing this the whole time. What the hell was I doing? Imagine if you altered your exercises every single session. God knows. And what are you going to do? Write down in your notebook, this is exactly where I grabbed the bar. No, you're never going to remember that stuff. And even if you remember it, your nervous system is not going to remember it. So what used to feel good back then might not feel good anymore. Your body changes, so on and so forth. Basically, if you always switch exercises, you never really milk out as much stimulus to fatigue ratio as you can because your technique is never really fine-tuned and your mind-muscle connection is never really fine-tuned. Big downsides, which we can avoid if we don't always alter exercises. We don't alter rep ranges like crazy. We don't alter cadences like crazy. For example, just milking out a slow eccentric squat requires some coordination and some learning, right? You're like, ooh, that was too fast of a rep. That was too slow. Okay, like what's my mind-muscle connection going to be like? Because sometimes slow eccentrics can be powered by various muscles. Like you can sit back into a slow eccentric in a squat and like, oh wow, that's like a lot like glutes. But if you sit forward into it, you're like, wow, this is an eccentric that really fries my quads. That takes some sessions to figure out. But if you like one day you come in, you do regular squats. The next day you come in, you do slow eccentric squats. The day after you do power squats. Gee, you're never really settling into milking as much as you can at every one thing. Reason number 3, a bit more speculative, but there's growing evidence for this, right? The analogy here, so it's preparatory versus myofibrillar hypertrophy. The first analogy, just to frame your brain around this, is that when a skyscraper gets fixed after a hurricane, usually the fixes are not instant. Okay. So, especially if deep structures require upgrading, for example, if you're adding floors or taking away floors, that can take a long time. Just the same way that disaster repairs to a building are not instant, muscle growth is probably not instant, and it probably doesn't take days to occur at a deep level that doesn't recede days later, right? In fact, early muscle growth within the first days or even weeks might be a preparation for later, more long-lasting growth. Sometimes it's because of various connective structures and connective molecules that are installed in the actual muscles themselves, a variety of different reasons, and the thing is, with those early patterns of growth, because it's what we could call preparatory growth, if you train in a certain way, you get preparatory growth at first, and your body almost from an evolutionary perspective is like, oh, we'll make the preparations to grow, but we don't want to grow because that's really expensive to, calorically to have a bunch of new muscle around. We could do a whole lot more with these resources. If the stimulus persists, however, if it appears and reappears and reappears, the body sort of starts to think analogically like, fuck. All right, we're going to need this around. So let's lay down. We already have the prep. Let's lay down the actual muscle. Let's keep it around. And then so when the stimulus recedes, we know it's probably coming back because it just keeps coming back. If you just have a couple of exposures or one exposure to a stimulus, sort of from an evolutionary logic perspective, your body has no reason to think that it's going to come back around, right? Like a lion attacks you once ever. Like, are you going to get super jacked because of one lion attack? Like, probably not. It's probably only get attacked by a lion every now and again. But if you get attacked by lions every week, then your body's inclined to think that, okay, whatever, I need to get more jacked and so on and so forth to prevent these lion attacks from killing me. It seems to be a regular thing, so it's probably a good idea to upgrade. That's the evolutionary logic behind how these adaptations could have evolved. But the fact is, we're sitting here in the modern age and we have these adaptations as a consequence of our evolutionary past. So we have pretty decent reason to believe that muscle growth isn't just like, okay, you train, you grow, the cycle ends 2 or 3 days later, and then it starts anew right over, and it's just a matter of like filling sand into a sand pile. It's probably a lot more like building a skyscraper. You need to make drafts first, you need a scaffold first, and then when you have sufficient funding and everything works out, then you build the floors and you connect the wires and the electricity and so on and so forth. It doesn't just all happen at once, and it takes a while to do, right? So a lot of evidence for this comes in the following form. Beginners, when you train them for 2 months and then you stop training them, they lose their muscle fast and they lose it permanently. So you train a beginner for 2 months or so, and then you don't train them for 2 months, they don't gain muscle any faster after that than complete beginners again. There's no memory of the fact that they ever trained in their muscles. But if you take folks that have been training for 6 months, a year, longer, and you stop training them, they can lose almost all their muscle. Sometimes they don't even lose all their muscle. A lot of it just sticks around. But even if they lose a lot of muscle, they end up being able to regain muscle really rapidly after they start, because some of those preparatory fixtures may never go away, or they're still laid down. They're slowly going away, but not immediately. So here's the thing. If you stimulate certain motor units via training one way over and over and over, the preparatory growth phase leads to what we call the myofibrillar growth phase, where actual fully functioning muscles are installed. But if you always change the pattern, then you say you stimulate some motor units here this week, they lay down preparatory structures. Next week, you do a different incline variant or something like that. Different fibers get hit to their limits, and they're no longer the same fibers. And the fibers that were initially targeted and stimulated and laid down preparatory methods, kind of waiting around like, well, I guess there's nothing happening. And they start to take the preparatory stuff and basically break it down. And then the next time they're stimulated, let's say 2 weeks later, it's like they never have been trained before. So you don't actually keep any of the gains. But if you stimulate 2 or 3 times in a row, there may be a degree of adaptation that never really recedes, or recedes very slowly. Because now that there's been multiple exposures, your muscles, in a sense, have all the preparation laid down, and then they lay down the more final structures. Those probably don't just go away, right? Not easily in any case. Lastly, on a very related note, I was debating whether or not to make this 3 points or 4, is a special case of preparatory myofibrillar hypertrophy. It is myonuclear domain expansion. Very well documented, and is a special form of long-term hypertrophy. Here's how it works. Myonuclear domain is a cell nucleus, the control center of the cell, and all of the area of the volume of a muscle cell that it controls around it, right? Just like, a city government can only control a city that's of a certain size. And like the further you get away from city government, the more people don't pay attention to specific laws, because nobody's going to come out there and enforce it. Think about if you live in the middle of nowhere in Arizona and there's a county sheriff, right? The county sheriff, their myonuclear domain volume, or area in this case, is that entire county. How good are they about responding in a timely manner to various needs in the county? Like, hey, like my dog's missing, or my dog climbed up a tree to try to eat my cat. Like, when can you get here, sheriff? And he's like, I don't know, like an hour and a half, because it takes forever to drive across this giant ass county. Not the most effective government potentially. Or imagine a really giant corporation, like, RP's not that big of a corporation. For me to get approval to work on a project, I call Nick Shaw. In 5 minutes, he says, great, and I start the project. If I was working for General Motors, General Electric, AT&T, Amazon, how many pieces of how long would it take for me to get approval on something? Oh my God, months? Years sometimes? You got to talk to 50 other people and everyone has to sign off on it. There's a huge chain of command. Just the same way a nucleus in a muscle cell literally sort of is in charge of maintaining and keeping up and improving its cellular volume around it. The further out you go, the longer it takes for the nucleus to ship certain molecules or get information about certain structural deficiencies. And at a certain domain volume, a certain distance away from the nucleus in all directions, it's too slow. And so, for example, if you have a muscle tear, and you're born with some kind of genetics where myonuclear domain ceiling just not installed, right? So all the normal human muscles have an understanding of how much is too much. Let's say you don't have one. Your muscles get so big that the outer rims of them are so far from the nucleus that the muscular proteins they just naturally degrade anyway from just contraction. The time it takes to heal them becomes crazy, right? 2 weeks after a training session, you're still damaged. What's that going to? That's going to result in injury, right? In degradation, all kinds of really weird stuff. You got to have a creatine kinase of crazy, crazy levels because there's parts of your muscle membrane broken and leaking ions everywhere into your blood, slowly killing you and destroying your kidneys. And there's nothing you can do about it because your nucleus is like, oh my God, eons in this tiny little nucleus can't control all the stuff around it, right? So the good news is that doesn't almost ever happen in the human body because when you start training in the beginner stages of training, the first several weeks or months of training, any particular area of the body, what ends up happening is there's a nucleus and the nucleus says, hey, grow, 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 and it helps control the stuff and growth occurs around it. When your myonuclear domain ceiling is hit, the nucleus basically, the muscle cell figures out like, yeah, you know what? This nucleus can no longer control and help any more of the cell. We need more nuclei to come in to the outside of the cell, take over and have their own areas of expansion. That's basically like, as the United States was being discovered and various parts of it were being populated, it's not like New York City started out over here and then 500 miles out is all New York City. No, like there's different, say, Newark and are there various parts of New Jersey nobody cares about? Just kidding, New Jersey. Love you guys. Right? Philadelphia, whatever. All different cities are born so that they can control their own little governance areas so that one central controller doesn't have anything to do. How many people in the United States, does Washington, D.C. control everything? Only in a very general sense, right? Like, does Washington, D.C. control the exact speed limits in Kansas City? No, Kansas City is controlling that. And as the United States expanded out and expanded, within itself to more and more population density, suburbs expand, and they get their own names, they get their own little governments, same as new nuclei. So the question is, as your muscle cells grow, where the heck do these new nuclei come from? Well, it turns out they're in what are called satellite cells, which are like sort of dormant cells. They're muscle cells, but they're mostly nuclei with very few myofibrils, very few actual contractile elements around them, sometimes none. They just sit there on the outside and within the muscle cell or in between muscle cells, and they just don't do a whole lot of anything. At some point, when myonuclear domain ceilings start to be reached, these limits start to get reached, some sort of signaling process, which is still a little bit mysterious to us, tells these satellite cells to donate their nuclei into the existing cells that have a whole bunch of contractile elements that actually help you do work. The nuclei are donated. Satellite cell is no more. Its nucleus sort of fuses the cell into this other cell, and now there's another nucleus. So maybe you had only, this much muscle that you can control with one nucleus. You get this other nucleus. Now you have pretty much double the muscle that you can control, which is really, really awesome. Here's the thing. If you train only enough to expand your to expand the muscle cell to less than its myonuclear domain, it's been shown that if you lose that muscle by training another way or stopping training, it goes away almost completely and there's almost no memory of it whatsoever. And regrowing it takes damn near as much time as it took to grow it the first time. However, if you grow a muscle enough to where its myonuclear domain ceiling is reached and other nuclei come in to help out, once they get integrated, it seems like they either rarely leave or never leave for the rest of the lifetime of the muscle. So what ends up happening is that these nuclei float in, they expand the domains around them, and now you have this larger muscle that when it shrinks, if you train it differently or you train it barely at all, it shrinks only to a fraction of the size which it would shrunk otherwise, right? A larger fraction of that size. And if you come back to retrain it in a different way, it makes incredibly fast gains because there's tons of nuclei to power those gains as opposed to just one, right? So it regains muscle size like crazy. And this is super, super well documented, right? Here's the deal. If you stick to one method of training that trains certain motor units really hard for weeks and weeks and weeks, those motor units grow so much, the muscle cells they control grow so much that they're like, crap, myonuclear domain. They reach it and they have to import other nuclei from satellite cells. And then they expand. Every time they import more nuclei, you get a sort of hammering in of more permanent adaptations, because there's a certain level of size that muscle will never go back down to. And it regains muscle super quick if you start training it that way again. So for example, if you do leg presses for like 8 weeks, those muscle fibers that are responsible for the leg press in a particular fashion that you put your feet and quad activation, they're more likely to absorb more myonuclei and thus get that more permanent growth. Once you go to hack squats after 8 weeks, some of those muscle fibers are no longer getting hit as hard, no longer get challenged. They'll shrink a little bit, but not much. And they have that memory of how they used to be back in the day when at peak leg press. You train the other muscle fibers more with hack squatting, so they get bigger. When you go back to leg pressing again after 8 weeks, then you regain the size within like the first week or two, leg press specific size. And then it's all 6 weeks of completely novel gains. But if you do hack squat 1 week, leg press another, hack squat 1 week, leg press another, you kind of this, kind of that, kind of this, kind of that, and you may not go nearly as far. Now, of course, on average, you'll still gain muscle and hit myonuclear domains, and you'll incorporate cells or myonuclei, and you'll grow, but it's probably better to do real distinct runs at a specific set of motor units, which you do through various exercise selections or rep ranges. And then once that occurs, you cool it, go to some other combination of exercises, but you've got a much more permanent approach here. Another really quick analogy on a neural level is learning language. Like if you do a week of French and a week of Spanish and a week of Russian and a week of German, you probably learn absolutely nothing by the end of the month. It's way too confusing. There's no solidification that occurs. You think, Jesus Christ, I studied languages for 4 weeks. I should know something. You learn like hola in Spanish and, something you thought in German. It turns out it's not a word, right? However, if you take 3 months of each language in succession, right, then what you end up doing is by the end of your 3 months of French, like you legit straight up know some French. And for those of you who have learned other languages, you know how this works. You learn some bit of a language, you never forget. Especially as you're a child, but even as an adult. If you learn to a certain level, it just doesn't ever go away. Or if it goes away, when you start speaking French again, you're like, whoa, it just goes back up really fast. We want to get to that sort of semi-permanence in our muscle growth, which is why hammering away at the similar direct adaptation is a good idea. Too much variation takes away from that. So that's reason number 4. All right. Yahoo! Lots of stuff. That was super awesome. Those are our 4 big reasons direct adaptation works. What are the programming recommendations that we can build based off of those? So you want to choose at the beginning of a muscle growth program a certain set of exercises with relatively low volumes and low relative intensities. You don't want to push it super hard because remember, novelty is taking care of a lot of your growth for you. If you push it super hard, you just get a ton of damage. So start easy. Every week, you want to increase the load to some extent and probably the volume on each exercise as needed. More on that in a later lecture. We'll talk about exactly how, and we'll talk about, we're going to develop algorithms for how to decide how much to increase by. Don't worry, all those are solved problems. But we're going to keep the stimulus nice and strong, which is going to require more. Notice that's still directed adaptation. It's not like that. Like you don't do 3 sets 1 week and then 18 sets the next. That would make no damn sense, right? Of course, we can't do that forever with the same exercises. Staleness is a thing. So once performance improvement on an exercise stalls out and even falls off a little bit for probably an entire mesocycle, just so we're sure, or connective tissues and muscles and joints start to have pain in them, and pain probably indicative of micro injury, then we know that there's like a little bit too much cumulative fatigue. We need to switch the way we're training. Like you've done so many leg presses that your knees hurt, and when you try hack squats, turns out your knees don't hurt because there's different lines of force. You say, okay, well, why the hell am I still doing leg presses? Good idea. You shouldn't be, right? Then you can switch to new exercise when you're not getting really good gains and or when little mini injuries are adding up. We're going to have an exact algorithm as to how to figure that out later. So don't worry about that. We'll get to that in a future lecture. But basically, that's the gist of the process. So what we're really saying is like, as long as we're getting gains from an exercise And as long as we're not injured for that exercise, more often than not, we're just going to default to keeping it because of the so many benefits of keeping a certain exercise, certain rep range, so on and so forth. And if we're moving through sets and we're moving through weight, we're doing it very slowly, very meticulously, right? This means that some exercises will be used for a year or more straight. Like, you ask yourself, should I still be high bar squatting? The answer is your gains are great. They're super consistent. Your mind-muscle connection is awesome. Stimulus to fatigue ratio is awesome. And you don't have any joint aches or pains. Why would you stop? Why would you stop? There's no good reason to stop. Keep going, right? So you could do that for a year or more straight. And some exercises, maybe from 1 to 3 months. Sometimes you have to switch for various reasons. It's an exercise that causes a little, too much wear and tear, or it quickly becomes really stale. Usually that's at least a mesocycle of 1 to 3 months. There's very, very few cases outside of like, whoa, this exercise is just going to get me hurt if I keep doing it. It just doesn't work for my body, which is possible. Outside of that case, you really shouldn't be switching exercises any more often than one mesocycle, which is usually 1 to 3 months in duration. So you accumulate slowly, deload, and then maybe you change exercises, not for sure. But there's almost no situation in which like Monday, you'll do incline bench, next Monday, you'll do flat bench, then decline after that. That would make very little sense. There's scarcely a place for weekly exercise rotation in most training. So a couple common examples, and this will be on your screen for you to read. If you want to pause the video and read these more slowly, you can. Basically, take a relative beginner. Let's say they begin squatting roughly 100 pounds for 3 sets of about 10 reps, right? Slowly over the weeks, over the months, you work up to squatting 160 pounds for 8 sets of 10 reps, which is way more, but we got there with really, really gradual elevations, right? Still the same exercise, by the way. And that takes, let's say, 6 months, right? And now your knees feel a little bit funky and squat gains are really slow and maybe non-existent. So you switch to close stance Smith machine squats, which are quite a different exercise. And then you start with 3 sets of 10 or so at 120 pounds. It just happens to challenge you at that number of sets and reps. And you begin to climb again. You maybe end those at 160 because they're a more challenging exercise 4 to 6 months later. And then you could go back to squat 6 months after that and then start at like 140 and go all the way up to 180. Sound like how gains are made, right? Small steps through cycles and cycles and cycles, never making huge changes, but slowly making changes as needed, right? And the other example here, and this is to illustrate a specific point, you start doing assisted dips, right? Somebody tells you, hey, dips are really good for triceps. And you're like, it makes sense biomechanically. I'm going to try them. You do the assisted dips because you maybe not strong enough to do bodyweight dips yet for any kind of meaningful reps. And they feel super awkward. Here's the take home from this example. Don't quit. Don't quit. Right? A lot of people are like, oh, that feels weird. I'm going to be done. All exercise kind of feels weird when you first start. Remember back when you first did any kind of squatting or anything, you were like, this is awful. I want to die. Right? And now you think squats are great. So give it a chance, right? Week after week, your mind-muscle connection will probably improve with those assisted dips. Your technique is going to stabilize and feel really familiar. Week 2, you came in and you're like, oh God, these things again. Week 5, you're like, aha, I know exactly what to do. I know where to put my hands. I know how to arc my chest. Everything's super good to go. And after a mesocycle, you'll probably be really getting stronger and the exercise will feel super great. And you'll be like, wow, I'm torching my triceps. And someone's like, what about your elbows? You're like, they feel fine. They'll feel a little weird the first couple weeks before I got the hint on the technique, but now they feel super great. After 4 mesocycles of these dips, your gains on them probably halt and, you could be switching at that point to close grip bench presses, right? Which again will feel strange, but that's okay because there's a momentum that results from doing similar things over and over and getting a little bit better at them over time, which is really kind of almost the morality of hypertrophy gains is if you're willing to do similar things over a long time and just eke out little tiny improvements, that's the best way to set yourself up for the most awesome things possible, which is, of course, being the most jacked person alive or even the most jacked person dead. I'll take that title. So, summary and implications here. It can be tempting to use novelty for its own sake. Different sometimes feels cool, often feels cool, and it helps sort of you get sore. If you do different exercises every single session, you get sore every time, which can be mistaken for like, that's a good thing. Put it this way, if you're never getting sore, you might not be training as hard as you could be. But if you're always super duper sore, you're probably just damaging a whole lot where you could be growing much more. So there's a balance there that you have to strike. There's probably such a thing as too sore, and training differently all the time one of two things will happen. You'll either be way too sore all the time if you use appropriate volumes to get the best growth, or you'll have to use such tiny volumes to not get sore that you might not be ever training with enough volume to cause a whole lot of growth. You're just sort of altering things for their own sake. If we want maximum hypertrophy, we have to do the right things, not the tempting things. So you want to focus on improving your technique and mind-muscle connection with similar exercises, slowly get stronger, slowly add volume, and of course, at some point, you're going to be much stronger, doing much more volume. The exercise will become stale or a little bit more injurious. Then you can switch out the exercises as needed to build the best long-term muscle that you can. I hope that made as much sense coming out of my mouth as it did in my head. Folks, see you next time for lecture number 2, which I think, let me see if I can bring out my handy-dandy lecture guide here, is going to be about training modality compatibility. See you then.